My name is Marie Hebert from the Southeast Asia chair here at CSIS. We're delighted all of you have joined us here today. My job is to introduce the introducer very briefly. Nisha Desai Biswal, of the Assistant Administrator for Asia for the USAID, will introduce the Chief Justice. Nisha has been in this position for the past 2 years. Previously, she served on the Committee of Appropriations on the House of Representatives, and earlier she'd been Director of Policy and Advocacy at Interaction, and before that she was the professional staff of the House International Relations Committee. Nisha, it's a delight to welcome you back to CSIS and thank you for this role. And after the Chief Justice has spoken, Nisha will make some comments. And as I mentioned, if you get paper and write down your questions, the Chief Justice will look at what questions she can answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, you're tall. Thanks very much for hosting this really interesting and exciting gathering. And before I introduce the Chief Justice, I wanted to just say a couple of words. One is the incredible leadership that CSIS has provided on addressing and exploring all matters Southeast Asia, and that the Southeast Asia practice at CSIS has been robust and has been incredibly important and influential in helping shape and influence U.S. policy as well. So thank you for that leadership. And you know, as we speak, Ernie Bauer is in Manila. And if any of you follow him on Twitter, you know that he's been tweeting about all of the exciting things that are happening in the Philippines. He's been tweeting about the fact that there's a renewed a renaissance in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the enterprises, and in terms of the efficiency that is being experienced across the Philippines. And I think that President Aquino and the administration, his administration, deserve an enormous amount of credit for the vision that they have brought and the will and determination that they have brought in how they're moving the country forward. From USAID's perspective, you can find no better partner and no greater opportunity than when that vision and that will and determination exist. And that's when you want to go deep and double down and see how far you can go. And so what's extraordinarily exciting about the opportunity and the discussion today is that it's not just in the executive branch that we have this opportunity, but also in the judicial branch. And with the appointment of Chief Justice Sereno, and you know, it's remarkable, one, to have the first female Chief Justice in the Philippine Supreme Court, to have the youngest Chief Justice in the Filipino Supreme Court, and the ability to therefore embark on a journey that really can last into the coming decades. She brings to the bench her own deep experience and perspectives, both in terms of access to justice and human rights, but also the very deep knowledge of commercial law and the importance of an effective and efficient judiciary to having an effective and efficient economy, one that meets the needs of its people and fulfills the hopes and aspirations of its people. So for USAID, again, the opportunity to work with, collaborate with, partner with the judicial branch, with the Supreme Court, with the court system in general, is a wonderful one that we are very determined to fully explore and exploit to advance those issues. I don't want to belabor the introduction because I actually want to make sure that we have the fullest amount of time for the conversation today, but I just wanted to close with one, saying how deeply honored we are to be partners in the Philippines, and two, to also note that this isn't a time of deep challenge in the Philippines with respect to Typhoon Bopha and the devastation that it wreaked. And our hearts and condolences are with the people of the Philippines. Our support is there with them in this time of need, and we wanted to not forget that moment as well as we talk about the future opportunities for the relationship. Finally, as I conclude, let me just, for those who are following online and on Twitter, make sure that you know that if you want to tweet on the conversation, it's hashtag BTLF Sereno. Hashtag BTLF Sereno, Banyan Tree Leadership Forum Sereno. So we look forward to your engagement both in the room and online. Thank you very much. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to bring to the podium Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno.
Thank you very much, Anisha. It's indeed an honor because I was informed that this is quite a high caliber group. And this is precisely the kind of opportunity that I would not pass up, knowing that I have taken the effort to come all the way from half across the globe to be with you this afternoon. And I will divide my talk basically to three parts. First, I want to just briefly tell you why I'm here. And I think it's quite important for us to understand that I'm not in the political realm, so I'm not here because I need votes. I guess my office is assured for the next 18 years. So I'm here because I want us to be understood, and I want to develop partnerships across the globe of all those who believe ardently in the need for judicial reform in the Philippines. And I've gone out of my way to be a communicator as well to you, who I believe have a keen interest in seeing the country move forward, in knowing why the Chief Justice has come here basically to touch base with people who believe in judicial reform, as well to have a very high level and very important discussion with Chief Justice John Roberts, who was joined by Justice Clarence Thomas. And of course, may I please just briefly introduce the other justices who are here with me. As you can see, this is quite an important event for us because no less than the second most senior Associate Justice in the court is here with me, Justice Presbitero Velasco, then Justice Mariano del Castillo, Justice Estela Perlas Bernabe. So we have more than a third of the Supreme Court here in this room. And then retired Justice Adolf Ascuna, who is the Chancellor of the Philippine Judicial Academy. It is important for me to explain who the Philippine judiciary is, what it needs to have moving forward. And therefore, I will start with a philosophical view of judicial reform, how it is not entirely new. But in a certain sense, there is a kind of renaissance that's going on in the Philippines with a renewed focus on judicial reform. Then I will briefly walk you through the four pillars of reform that I thought will undergird any effective and sustainable reform agenda. So I had done a little bit of thinking in my past positions of responsibility on how the relationship between judicial reform and the investment climate can be characterized. When I was in my mid-30s, I did a paper courtesy of the Danish Trust Fund through the World Bank, where I described judicial dysfunction and the cost of doing business in the Philippines. I did my Master of Laws degree in Ann Arbor, and I had the occasion to be exposed to the field of law and economics. So that kind of exposure that I'm grateful for to the American public for having had is responsible in large part on my specific attention to how we in the judiciary will not be perceived as obstacles to growth, but rather we can provide the environment in which, while we are the neutral arbiters, we can also ensure that if the country moves forward and the policymakers are correct and the people are responsive, then we are not going to stand in the way. In fact, we will undergird the stability of growth. And that is, I think, key to understanding our role in the judiciary. So my take on this is that judicial reform and economic reform sustain each other. Nisha was talking about how things are going great in the executive department. I am not in a position to comment on that because that's not my public role. But I do understand that judicial reform should be side by side with each other. In fact, it is only if the judiciary itself is stable and if there is created a platform for an investment climate where things are predictable that you can sustain this phenomenal growth percentage that we have been talking about. So I believe that economies can only prosper if a judicial regime is responsive, it is adequate, and it is sufficient. If we try to do business under such a system, we minimize some of the risks that are undertaken in everyday transactions, and we ensure a degree of protection for business interests within reasonable bounds. But the judiciary should not be considered as a cost center for those undergoing contract and business disputes. But we believe that instead of being considered as a cost center, we should be considered as a key element in the promotion of inclusive, sustainable, and equitable economic growth, especially for those who are poor and marginalized in developing countries. Calling from the collective experiences of judicial reform in other countries, I have come increasingly to realize that more than ever, the intersection and interdependence of the justice system and economic growth exists. It had not always been perceived to be so. There was a time when concerns about economics and markets were divorced from the issues of courts. Courts were seen as problems of public sector and administrative governance. Economists paid little attention to the impact of courts in analyzing why some economies grew while others did not. But there were already periodic introductions by some economists, some scholars at different points in history of the relationship between judicial performance and economic growth. In the 15th century, there was this Mr. John Fortescue, who was Chief Justice of the King's Bench in 1442 in England. He wrote a legal treatise, and it's called In Praise of the Laws of England. And he gave this very good insight. He said his country's prosperity is traceable to the quality of its legal institutions. Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, claimed that traders would be reluctant to enter into wealth-enhancing exchanges if there were not a reliable judicial system because of fears that their bargains would not be honored. Max Weber wrote in the 20th century that there was an advancement of some European countries over others and over China because the former had rationalized well-functioning judiciaries. But no one could have sounded more comprehensive at the time than Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, who said, "What is required? A tolerable administration of justice is one of the three essential conditions for economic growth. The other two being peace and low taxes. These three factors are necessary to..." Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to have an ideological line. Did they cross something somewhere?
It was very appropriate for Washington right now.
Oh, forgive me, but he's Scottish. Probably he doesn't understand Washington. Smith, a Scotsman, referred to these three factors as essentially necessary to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence. Courts are indeed vital for businesses because of their primordial function, which is to settle actual controversies. Courts interpret rules of the market and economic rights. Efficient and transparent courts encourage new business relationships and provide assurance that courts would act according to the terms of the contract and would dispatch someone who fails to perform it. As Hobbes puts it, when two parties enter a contract, he that performed first must have the assurance that the other will perform, because the bounds of words alone are too weak to bridle man's ambitions, avarice, anger, and other passions without the fear of some coercive power. And to a certain extent, courts provide this. The effectiveness of courts can enhance predictability and reduce uncertainty. Every country has its own legal judicial system, and the approach to contract enforcement also differs. With the World Bank, they came up with a measurement, basically defining 3 major factors for measuring the ability of enforcement of contracts in jurisdictions. Those 3 are time, cost, and number of procedures. The data that the World Bank produced may not exactly reflect what has been happening in every courtroom across the globe, but to a certain extent, it gives us a good indication of the ease or difficulty with enforcing contracts in each of the countries studied. And perhaps the strength really of the study is that it is uniformly applied, regardless of the dispute that we may have with the definitions that have been applied, that have been used. And when the degree of enforcement of contracts is considered as effective, then investors are assured that disagreements or conflicts can be resolved quickly. Businesses will then continue to flourish, will struggle to ensure that they survive, and if the environment is not conducive to the enforcement of contracts, businesses will simply fold up and vote with their feet. When courts are unable to enforce contract obligations, the tendencies are that businesses would adopt strategies to minimize the chance for contract breach, such as doing transactions in the spot market, exchanging money for merchandise, merging with suppliers or customers. All of these result in higher transaction costs, which can in turn cause a degree of retardation of the potentials for economic growth. Now, sadly, in the Philippines, the performance of the judicial system has, with all candor, been pointed out by the business sector as one of the obstacles and disincentives to doing business. And I'm quite forthright about the findings here. Difficulties in settling legal conflicts were the 6th most frequently cited factors affecting business, ranking even higher than poor physical infrastructure and access to credit. So if the review about the infrastructure buildup in the Philippines is quite good nowadays, then we have to really pay a lot of attention to judicial performance. What hampers the ability of courts to effectively enforce contracts can be a range of difficulties, most common of which are the high cost of litigation relative to the disposable income of a majority of the population, delay, unpredictability, and in some cases that have been anecdotally cited by businessmen, corruption. Now remember that we have been in the judiciary coping with the charge of corruption for a long time. We have asked the public to come forward with the evidence. The problem is until now, the evidence has not been forthcoming. This has put us in a very bad spot because while we cannot do something concrete to address the charges of corruption, the perception remains. So what we need really is cooperation by the citizenry in order that the facts will really come out about the presence or degree of corruption. These factors, when combined, lead to a poor level of confidence in the system, discouraging businesses from availing of court services, and in some cases, totally avoiding dealing with courts. Some pursue rent-seeking behavior to corrupt the system and ensure judicial relief from unscrupulous judges who are willing to accept bribes. While I'm willing to stake that majority of our judges are really good, honest, and hardworking, I have to admit that there still exist in our ranks those who give us problems. The difficulty for us, as we said, is we basically suffer from a lack of evidence from those who claim to have witnessed the corruption. What is formed, therefore, in some of our people's minds is the misguided perception that courts are not interested in improving the business environment and are even posing themselves as deterrents to gaining the expected benefits of an investment. And this is a sad observation that we are making here. We in the Philippine judiciary are quite aware of the challenges besetting judiciaries from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even some European countries, and even North America to a certain extent. This is brought about by the fact that economies continue to expand and have a multitude of problems. Trade activities are multiplying, transactions are going more complex, there are increasing pressures on the court to find immediate solutions to performance issues. There are demands on the judiciary to help create a positive atmosphere that contributes to inclusive economic development. Now, if this is therefore the expectation of the general public, and considering the increasing complication of today's modern economies, this is, I think, where judicial reform comes in. Judicial reform is actually a concept that had evolved from much earlier times than we may have thought. Before, hundreds of years ago, it was considered as a political movement, as it was a judicial action involved in sweeping changes in government policies, structural systems, and social culture. During the time of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, in the 1800s, judicial reform was credited for the emancipation of peasants and other far-reaching consequences for the life and welfare of the Russian people. In the early 1900s in China, the Qing, Beijing, and nationalist administrations started the construction of formal judicial infrastructure and the legal training of professionals that were seen as indispensable prerequisites for the successful overhaul of Chinese state and society. Much of the emphasis on judicial reform has been spurred by the recognition that we had already emphasized. That is, a well-performing judiciary is important for economic development. In the Philippines, large-scale judicial reform was initiated from 2001 to 2006. It was envisioned to create a well-functioning judicial system which is efficient, fair, accessible, transparent, independent, and autonomous, all of which are expected to restore public trust and confidence in the system and, in turn, lead to a socio-economic environment that is stable and predictable. These, of course, are the basic requisites for investors, both domestic and foreign, to invest in and continue investing in the country. Whereas before, the core of modern judicial reform programs typically consist of measures to improve the operation of the judicial branch of government and entities related such as bar associations and law schools, and consisted of training judges, building court-related infrastructures, introducing case management strategies and equipment. Today, these also include components on legal aid, the public attorney's office, and even police reform to answer a growing demand for a justice sector-wide approach that is holistic, encompassing, and sustainable. All these are part and parcel of a larger effort to make legal systems in developing countries and transition economies more market-friendly. However, judicial reform does not come readily available on a silver platter. We cannot guarantee immediate results. There are many potential pitfalls in the implementation. If we do not foresee them or we do not avoid them, it could lead to eventual failure and could even further complicate our already complicated problems. Our country needs to be willing to devote the necessary time and resources to initiate and sustain judicial reform, and that is part of the reason why I'm here today, to encourage you to continue the judiciary's quest for sustained and effective judicial reform by betting on the decision makers in our country the need to provide sufficient support to the Philippine judiciary. Coordination is important, even with those branches that we need to be independent from, in order that we may be able to address varied, duplicate, and sometimes conflicting but legitimate priorities placed on the table by justice sector stakeholders. The necessary funds to support a judicial reform program are often the hardest to secure, even from well-meaning governments, because its impact takes a long time to become apparent, and there is a great uncertainty if it will still be relevant by the time, given the fast-changing environment. Hence, the need to find more innovative ways to help the government raise funds for judicial reform. We can have different impacts on different countries, so we must start always on a needs assessment on the part of the Philippine judiciary. We should not fall into a trap of launching a program because it is nice to do, to impress stakeholders or whet the appetite of investors, but rather because we need to do it. A broad consensus on the need for significant change must be gathered from within the judiciary and among the branches and key departments of government to ensure the success of any reform program. The most crucial and critical element of any such program is a strong commitment of all stakeholders in the goals that they themselves have set. The impetus for continuing reform of our court system will only take root and succeed if it comes from within. This consensus must include a long-term commitment on the part of the government to provide the resources required for an effective judiciary. By the way, I'd just like to inform the public that the judiciary only merits a 0.78% allocation from our general appropriation annual, and it is considered as the third branch of government. So you will immediately be impressed by the disparity between the resource allocation and the demands being brought to bear upon us. More than just confining reform to mere allocation of resources and efficient court systems, we must lead the court to include an attitude reform. It is the more arduous task of ensuring that those who comprise the judiciary are not animated by a sense of entitlement because of their hallowed positions, but must be animated by an obligation of selfless service to the community. No single formula for court reform has so far been developed that is effective for all kinds of judiciaries. However, World Bank scholar Mr. Masick was able to identify 3 factors common to all successful reform programs: a strong commitment by the leaders of the judiciary, a sound grasp of the incentives judicial actors face, and a clear understanding of how the system is operating. If we expound on these success triggers, then the commitment is best exemplified by the active participation of those directly involved in administering justice, such as by judges, lawyers, and other judicial actors. Courts must find ways to reward those who contribute to better judicial performance and sanction those whose actions stand in its way. Lastly, Masick said that judicial reform efforts must have a solid empirical basis to determine its program priorities and not rely merely on perceptions that can deceive. Taking off from these points, allow me to share with you briefly the reform agenda that I propose to continue galvanizing all the stakeholders in. It has taken into consideration the initial and partial success we have had from the past, the challenges we confront at present, and the short, medium, and long-term goals in the future that we hope will not only enhance the administration and delivery of justice in our country, but will also contribute eventually to our economic wealth. The foundation of the judicial reform agenda that I will work on gaining consensus towards will be built around, I think, 4 logical pillars, and it will be characterized by the words effective and sustainable. Effectiveness of these reforms entail designing programs with purposeful, inclusive, and deliberate planning, measured by previously agreed upon performance indicators. So I am now signaling that the judiciary is open to being measured by the same kinds of measure that are accepted by all governance duty bearers. Sustainability of the project means ensuring that they are properly implemented, monitored, evaluated, and reiterated so that they become the standard or the norm. The first pillar is instituting integrity and restoring public trust and credibility. It relates to developing a sense of a higher morality and integrity in the bench and bar. We not need to embark on a system of rewards and punishment, a robust performance evaluation system, and a public communication campaign that highlights the values that make for good judges. And these are just some of the ideas that are in the pipeline to achieve this first pillar. The second pillar is ensuring the predictability, rationality, speed, and responsiveness of judicial actions. This would address the issues on uncertainty and delay, with the general objective of unclogging our heavy court dockets that, as of June 2012, are burdened with 605,000 cases spread out over 1,800 trial courts, lower trial courts. Our short-term target is to reduce the total number of pending cases by a significant percentage through a coordinated scheme of rationalizing case load distribution, creating a national pool of judges to fill out vacancies, developing court-specific case decongestion plans, digitizing court documents and automating court processes, resorting to alternative and indigenous dispute resolution mechanisms, and strengthening and emphasizing our judges' court adjudicatory functions. The long-term goal is to significantly minimize court backlog, make our case inventories current, and greatly improve case turnover and disposition. The third pillar is improving systems, processes, and infrastructure. This involves decentralizing offices in order to make them go down to the lowest feasible level, the upgrading of dilapidated and inadequate courthouses and physical facilities, modernizing our financial management systems, and instituting knowledge management systems. The advancement of new technologies in various court and case management systems will help contribute to making courts less prone to corrupting influences. It will contribute also to streamlining administrative tasks and functions and empower the courts to become more capable of responding to their more primary adjudicatory functions. Finally, the fourth pillar is developing efficient and effective human resources in order to professionalize the judiciary, eventually making the elite and the profession of choice. In addition to improving the salaries of judges and court personnel and enhancing the benefits to strengthen judicial independence, serious consideration must also be given to enhancing their skills and training in other emerging fields of law, such as in intellectual property and environmental protection. Inasmuch as laws are living concepts that continue to evolve with the passage of time, so too must our judiciary be capable of adapting to new developments. In doing all of these reforms, assumptions will be questioned, and traditional ways of doing things that have hindered growth must be reviewed, while completely being respectful of what keeps the judiciary intact, which are some of laudable traditions. To realize our collective objective of a modern, responsive, and visionary judiciary, we need to devise resourceful, creative, and homegrown solutions to the problems confronting the justice system today. Strategies must be formed and formulated that incorporates a multi-layered and inclusive approach to delays in litigation, lack of access to justice, and general distrust of the system in order to minimize risks and errors, ensure efficient use of our limited resources, and increase our chances of success. We have to provide committed leadership, gain partners such as you today who can help in the process, and grow reform champions from the community to have a strong support system that would keep our four pillars straight and sturdy. Together with all my colleagues in the Supreme Court, the lower court justices and judges and all court personnel, we have renewed our oath and commitment to modernizing a justice system that is in keeping with the significant economic gains being realized now by our people. We will no longer stand by and allow the judiciary to be seen or perceived as a scapegoat for holding back the progress to the Philippine economy. In affirming our commitment to the rule of law and the administration of justice, the Philippine Supreme Court is dedicated to becoming a factor in creating stability and predictability, and hopefully inspire increased trust and confidence in our country's potential and future as one of the tiger economies in Asia. I thank you for your patience, your kind attention, and a pleasant afternoon to everyone.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice, for that inspiring speech. Nisha has kindly agreed to make some comments, and at the same time, I've received some questions. So maybe while Nisha's commenting, besides listening to Nisha, you can look at those and see what you can.
Multitask.
Okay, great.
Wonderful. And I will keep my comments brief because I think that the Chief Justice did cover an incredible amount of both detail and scope in terms of the vision that she laid out for where she hopes to kind of take the judiciary in the Philippines. And she also made some incredibly important points about the linkages between efficient and effective judiciary and economic competitiveness in the country. And I think that those are important linkages. And it brings a little bit of the lens that we bring to this because within the U.S. government, about 18 months ago, 24 months ago, President Obama announced a Partnership for Growth initiative that talked about a partnership between the United States and countries which exhibited the political will and determination to join in that partnership to address what are the critical constraints to growth. And Philippines was chosen as one of the countries, 4 countries around the world where we were going to embark on this exercise. And in so doing, we jointly undertook a constraints analysis to look at what are the critical constraints. And amongst those constraints, one of the biggest binding constraints that came up was corruption, lack of transparency and efficiency in the interface between the government and business and private sector as a constraint to further private investment in the country. And so what we have sought to undertake is look at that in a holistic fashion, to look at that in all of its elements, and certainly, therefore, addressing these issues in the executive branch with respect to both promoting transparency, accountability, and efficiency has been critical, and the government has taken some very bold steps, not to say that the road is already been put behind us, but the road is still far ahead, but they've been taking some very bold steps to walk down that path. But it is not solely a path for the executive branch. It has to be holistically addressed. And so the role of the judiciary in establishing an efficient process and a rule of law that is transparent and predictable, as the Chief Justice noted, is critical. And so for the U.S. government, we have also sought to undertake this partnership in a whole-of-government way that looks at what are the assets that we can bring to bear as they walk down that path to support that. And so that has been a part of the lens with which we have brought our engagement and support for the Philippines. And in that, I want to say, first of all, that we have no stronger advocate and partner than Ambassador Cuisa, who has just been an outstanding representative for the Philippines in the United States and has helped us to also better understand and navigate these issues. So as the Chief Justice noted, I think that these are critical issues, and creating a more efficient judiciary is not only about the decongesting of the court systems, but that is certainly one major area in which we can work together. But then also creating that transparent and accountable confidence, and you spoke about this when you came to USAID a couple of days ago, about restoring the public confidence in the judiciary that will then allow the sustaining of that judiciary and the growing of that. And for that, I think you've laid out a powerful vision, and we look forward to working with you. And the last thought I would leave you with is the issue of judicial independence and the adequate resourcing of the judiciary is critically important, and it must be paired equally with, therefore, the judicial oversight that allows the other branches of government and the population to also feel the confidence in where and how those resources are going. And that is the checks and balances that exist in our society in the United States that are also there in the Philippine society that we can work together to advance. But with that, I want to turn the microphone back.
Great. Thanks, Nisha. That was great. Chief Justice, you want to respond? You can stay seated. Just
Thank you.
yes.
I cannot respond to 3 questions because these are specific cases pending before our courts. That is, I cannot make any comment on the framework agreement. I cannot make a comment on the Marcos cases. Neither can I make a comment on the Laguna dredging project of a Belgian contractor. That aside, I think the most critical of these questions have to do with your concern for judicial independence, our need for resources to come from the executive and the legislative branches of government and maintaining that independence. But that is precisely why we are here. I believe that while we recognize our interdependence, the judiciary's interdependence with the other branches, the independence that is required means that we should not be afraid to rule against any administration on the specific instance when we believe that it has crossed the bright red line that it must not cross. Having said that, we will have an operational problem then, how to raise resources. And that is where I want as many stakeholders to own the cause of judicial reform. That is why we have come here. We have come here to talk not only with the USAID, who can give us development assistance, the World Bank, who can do likewise, but also with the Filipino and American community that can continue to remind the government that it is only through a strong judiciary that you will ensure the stability of democracy in our country. It makes good sense to invest every dollar and cent on the condition that everything is fully accounted for in the judiciary. It makes every perfect economic sense. It makes good historical sense to do so. If we are going to invest in the future of our children, this is a way to go forward. And when enough stakeholders are there saying that one of our key desires is to see really an independent judiciary characterized by a sufficiently funded one, then I will see the other branches of government always trying to make or to take actions on the basis of a rule of law. They will always be bound by the parameters of the law, and that makes good sense for every economy. So this is part of the reason why I am here. And the concern that you have that if there is a new administration, the judiciary will be subjected to possible pressures is a concern that every judiciary in the world has. That is why all the stakeholders must be committed to their own judiciaries. We cannot have the specter of the judiciary where the public is clamoring for its members to step down. Rather, the ideal condition is for Philippine civil society and individual citizens to speak up for the judiciary, because by nature, we cannot be always defending ourselves. We are occupying the role of wise elders who will remain above the fray, who are not actively engaging in discussions before the media on the whys and therefores of our actions, but rather we are guided only by our conscience and the competence that we have developed over the years to do what is right according to the law. Now, there is also a question that concerns the judiciary's role in economic development, and if we can even bring it into a more aggressive role of really actively fostering economic development. Unfortunately, that is not our domain. Our domain is to be the honest arbiter of justiciable disputes. The direction of the economy, the modes by which economic progress is to be taken, the rate at which it is to be taken. These are all political questions, and these are questions to be determined in Congress with the leadership of the executive. The judiciary is completely off that fray. if our actions through our decisions contribute to stability, then it is a foundational element of economic growth. But we are not going to be the spurs. We are not going to be the engines for economic growth. And the other extent that the other questions have to relate to the extent of borrowing that we want to make from other countries on our judicial reform agenda. What I think the Filipino community must realize is that there are so many original ideas coming from Filipinos. I have gone nationwide and I have spoken to the judges. And you know, these are smart judges on the ground with operating problems and operating solutions that they have devised regardless of their resource constraints. You have young female judges creating their own database systems. They have created manuals without any support even from the Philippine Supreme Court in its central office. In other words, to the extent that the ideas, the identification of the problems, and the solutions can be homegrown, we are going to do it. Because we are going to show, and this is our intent, the world, that we know how to run our courts. We will not be dependent on foreign expertise as much as we are going to be dependent or on our own keen sense of what is right and what makes sense and what will work. So we need support from you to give us further confidence in developing these homegrown solutions. Because indeed, the prospect that we are offering to developing partners is that if you can make us showcases, that we can have case modules that you can showcase, in fact, to other countries on how homegrown solutions work, isn't it better all around for the development financing world? That we know how to make efficient use of resources because we know how to make this work up here. So the extent of borrowing is not something I'm worried about. What I'm worried about more is how to make an efficient system of calling all the bright ideas from our judges that are already out there, to create a system of getting the feedbacks and making it go through the process of validation between our different stakeholders. I'm more worried about creating a monitoring system to ensure that we are not off track. That is the more worrisome part of the operation of judicial reform. Originality is not a problem for me. I am sure we can show originality in many of the ideas, and yet being humble enough to admit that in the areas where we need help from, we will be very candid in saying, what happened in other countries? Could that possibly work in ours? Finally, the last question here, the last two questions has to do with Philippine-U.S. relations. I think that I'm not going to make a general statement of that because that is the domain of Ambassador Quisha in the State Department on whether this is good or not for Philippine-U.S. relations. But let me leave you with this thought. The meeting with Chief Justice John Roberts this morning was incisive and thoughtful. From my point of view and the point of view of the justices from the Supreme Court, it was a historic occasion. So allow me to leave you with that note. And the last is whether Tagalog will ever be embraced in our courts. The trials right now in our regions are even being conducted in the native tongue, with interpreters interpreting it into English. But it is doing that right now, so that witnesses are already talking in the vernacular. You can be assured. But perhaps what the member of the audience wanted to find out is whether we are going to see the resurgence of Tagalog decisions from the Supreme Court in the era of Justice Perfecto. Maybe. We don't know. One of us can one day write a beautiful prose, a beautiful piece of literature in the form of a decision in the Supreme Court. It may happen. As in the same way that I see a resurgence of confidence in Philippine culture and art, that can also be confidence in our native language. That's not a foreclosed possibility. So with that, I think I've answered all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chief Justice, for that inspiring overview of your efforts to reform the judiciary in the Philippines. Thank you very much, Nisha, for joining us today for your thoughts and your ideas on